The prison yard was loud with iron and arrogance. Weights slammed. Boots scraped concrete. Men laughed like nothing here could ever surprise them. Then the laughter stopped. A bully stepped up behind the old inmate and wrapped a forearm around his throat, dragging him backward into the open space. "Look at this," the bully shouted. Grandpa wandered out of the retirement home. The old man's cane clattered to the ground. Everyone expected panic, a struggle, a collapse. None of it happened. The elderly inmate didn't thrash, didn't claw for air. He stood there, upright, letting the hold settle. That's when the yard began to feel wrong. His breathing stayed slow, measured. He shifted one foot back, just an inch. Lowered his center of gravity without looking. Movements too clean, too practiced. The bully felt it before he understood it. "What?" he muttered, tightening his grip. The old man finally spoke, voice calm, almost instructional. "If you're going to choke someone," he said quietly, "you don't stand on their strong side." The bully's grip loosened, not from fear, from instinct. Because somewhere deep inside, his body recognized something ancient and dangerous. The calm of a man who had survived real battlefields, where mistakes meant bodies didn't get back up. And the yard fell completely silent. Stay with me until the end, because when the guards uncover this old inmate's military record, the entire prison will realize they just witnessed a legend waking up. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get started. The concrete walls of Milbrook Correctional Facility had seen their share of violence over the decades. Gang wars, stabbings, riots that lasted 3 days and left scars on men's souls. But nothing like what was about to unfold that Tuesday afternoon in the recreation yard. His name was Edward Crane, though most inmates just called him Gramps. 74 years old, with silver hair and hands that shook when he poured his coffee. He walked with a wooden cane, took his meals alone, and spent most days reading paperback westerns in the corner of the library. To everyone watching, he looked like exactly what he appeared to be. An old man serving out his final years for some white-collar crime that finally caught up with him. The other inmates treated him with the casual indifference reserved for those who posed no threat. Some younger prisoners even helped him reach books on high shelves or saved him a spot in the chow line. Edward never asked for help, but he accepted it with quiet nods and soft thank yous that made him seem harmless, forgettable. What none of them knew was that Edward Crane had another name. A name that struck fear into enemy combatants across 3 different theaters of war. Staff Sergeant Eddie the Ghost Crane, 26 years of active duty, 2 tours in Vietnam, 3 deployments in the Middle East, a man who had survived ambushes that wiped out entire platoons and earned commendations that most soldiers only dreamed of receiving. But that was a lifetime ago. Now he was just another aging convict counting down the days until his release, trying to serve his time without drawing attention to himself. The tax evasion charges that landed him here weren't glamorous, but they carried a mandatory minimum sentence that meant 3 more years behind these walls. The trouble started with Marcus "Bull" Patterson, a mountain of a man who controlled the prison's black market trade in cigarettes and contraband. Bull stood 6 feet 5 inches and weighed close to 300 pounds, most of it muscle earned through decades of lifting weights and intimidating anyone who looked at him wrong. His arms were covered in tattoos that told the story of his rise through various gangs, and his reputation for violence kept even the guards nervous. Bull had built his empire on fear and respect, two currencies that demanded constant reinforcement in a place like Milbrook. Every new inmate was sized up, categorized, and either recruited or neutralized. The weak became victims. The strong became allies or enemies. But Edward Crane presented a puzzle that Bull couldn't quite solve. The old man didn't fit any of the usual categories. He wasn't weak enough to victimize easily, but he certainly didn't look strong enough to be a threat. He kept to himself, never caused trouble, and seemed content to fade into the background. For months, Bull had mostly ignored him, focusing on more pressing matters like territorial disputes with rival gangs and maintaining his network of loyal followers. But respect in prison was a fragile thing, and lately, Bull had been feeling pressure from younger inmates who questioned whether he was getting soft. Some whispered that he'd lost his edge, that maybe it was time for new leadership. The whispers reached Bull's ears through his network of informants, and they stung worse than any physical wound. That's when Bull's attention turned to Edward Crane. The old man represented something Bull could use, an easy target that would remind everyone exactly who ran things in this prison. A demonstration that would silence the whispers and reinforce the fear that kept his empire intact. The plan was simple: humiliate the old man in front of as many witnesses as possible. Make him beg. Show everyone that even the most harmless-looking inmate could be broken if Bull decided it needed to happen. It would be quick, public, and effective. A reminder that nobody was beyond his reach. Bull chose the recreation yard for maximum visibility. Tuesday afternoon was when most inmates were outside, either working out with the weight equipment or playing basketball on the cracked asphalt courts. The guards usually positioned themselves near the main entrance, giving them a clear view of the entire area, but also creating blind spots where certain activities could unfold, without immediate intervention. Edward was sitting on a concrete bench near the fence, reading one of his westerns and seemingly oblivious to the world around him. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard, and a light breeze carried the sounds of men talking, laughing, and going about their routines. It was the kind of peaceful moment that rarely lasted long in a place like this. Bull approached slowly, his crew of loyal followers spreading out to form a loose circle around the bench. Other inmates sensed something was about to happen and began gravitating toward the area, some out of curiosity, others hoping to witness the kind of violence that would give them stories to tell for years to come. The yard gradually grew quieter as more men noticed Bull's purposeful movement toward the elderly inmate. Conversations died out. The rhythmic clanging of weights being lifted and dropped became the dominant sound. Even the basketball game on the far court seemed to slow as players realized something significant was developing. Edward looked up from his book, his pale blue eyes meeting Bull's dark stare with an expression of mild curiosity rather than fear. He marked his page with a thin piece of cardboard and set the book aside, his movements deliberate and unhurried despite the obvious threat approaching. "Afternoon," Edward said politely, as if greeting a neighbor over a backyard fence rather than acknowledging a predator stalking toward him. Bull stopped directly in front of the bench, his massive frame blocking out the sun and casting Edward into shadow. The size difference was dramatic. Bull looked like he could crush the old man with his bare hands, and everyone watching knew it. "You know what I think, old-timer?" Bull's voice carried across the yard, pitched loud enough for everyone to hear. "I think you've been getting too comfortable around here, acting like you belong, like you're one of us. Of us." Edward remained seated, his weathered hands folded calmly in his lap. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut, ready to snap. Bull's crew shifted restlessly, waiting for their leader to make his move, to remind everyone why crossing him meant pain. "See, that's your problem right there," Bull continued, his voice growing louder with each word. "You think because you're old, because you look harmless, that gives you some kind of pass. But there ain't no passes in here, Gramps. Everyone pays respect, or everyone pays the price." The crowd of inmates had grown larger now, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. Some leaned against the fence, others stood with arms crossed, all waiting to see how this would unfold. The guards at the far end of the yard seemed oblivious to the brewing tension, their attention focused on a group of younger inmates playing cards near the basketball courts. Edward nodded thoughtfully, as if Bull had just shared some profound wisdom about the weather. "I understand your position," he said quietly. "Respect is important in a place like this. Keeps order, prevents chaos." Bull blinked, caught off guard by the old man's calm response. He'd expected fear, maybe pleading, certainly not this measured acknowledgement of prison hierarchy. It threw him off his rhythm, made him feel like he was missing something important. "That's right," Bull said, recovering his momentum. "And since you understand, you won't mind showing everyone here exactly where you stand in that order." Edward stood slowly, using his cane for support, his movements deliberate and careful. At full height, he barely reached Bull's shoulder. The contrast was almost comical, a giant facing down a grandfather who looked like he should be feeding pigeons in a park somewhere. "What exactly did you have in mind?" Edward asked, his tone still conversational, as if they were discussing lunch plans rather than a public humiliation. Bull's grin spread wider. This was going better than he'd hoped. The old man was cooperating, which would make the demonstration even more effective. Sometimes the best lessons came from willing participants who understood their role in the larger drama. "Simple," Bull said, stepping closer until he was towering directly over Edward. "You're going to get down on your knees, right here in front of everyone, and you're going to apologize for thinking you were too good to pay your respects when you first arrived." A murmur rippled through the watching crowd. Some inmates shook their heads, already knowing how this would end. Others leaned forward with anticipation, hungry for the kind of spectacle that would give them something to talk about for weeks. Edward considered Bull's demand for a long moment, his pale blue eyes studying the younger man's face with an intensity that made several onlookers shift uncomfortably. There was something in that gaze, something that didn't quite match the frail exterior everyone had grown accustomed to seeing. "I've been thinking about respect lately," Edward said finally, his voice carrying just far enough for the entire crowd to hear. "Funny thing about respect. Most people think it comes from being the biggest, the loudest, the most feared. But real respect, the kind that lasts, that comes from something entirely different." Bull's expression darkened. This wasn't how these conversations were supposed to go. The old man should have been stammering, begging, maybe offering to do favors or share his commissary money. Instead, he was giving some kind of philosophical lecture that made Bull feel like a student being corrected by a teacher. "You think I care about your philosophy, old man?" Bull snarled. "You think words are going to save you from what's about to happen?" Edward shifted his weight slightly, a subtle movement that somehow made his stance look more solid, more grounded. His cane remained in his right hand, but his grip had changed. Not tighter, exactly, but more purposeful, like a tool being prepared for use rather than just a support for walking. "I think," Edward said quietly, "that you have no idea who you're talking to." The words hit the yard like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of tension through the assembled crowd. Several inmates exchanged glances, suddenly uncertain about what they were witnessing. This didn't feel like the usual prison bullying anymore. Something had shifted, though most couldn't put their finger on exactly what. Bull felt it too, that subtle change in the atmosphere. The old man's posture hadn't changed dramatically, but there was something different about him now. An alertness that hadn't been there before. A coiled readiness that made Bull's instincts whisper warnings he couldn't quite understand. "Is that supposed to scare me?" Bull laughed, but the sound carried less confidence than before. "You're just some old fool who thought he could outsmart the IRS and ended up in here with the rest of us. Whatever you think you used to be, that's over now." Edward nodded slowly, as if Bull had just confirmed something he'd been wondering about. "You're right about one thing. What I used to be, that's definitely over. But what I am now, what I've always been underneath all the pretending, that never really goes away." The temperature in the yard seemed to drop several degrees, despite the afternoon sun beating down on the concrete. Other inmates began backing away slightly, their survival instincts picking up signals their conscious minds couldn't quite process. Even Bull's crew looked uncertain now, their usual swagger replaced by a wariness they couldn't explain. Bull realized he'd lost control of the narrative. This was supposed to be quick and brutal, a demonstration of power that would end with the old man broken and humiliated. Instead, he found himself engaged in some kind of psychological chess match he didn't understand the rules for. "Enough talking," Bull growled, reaching out with his massive right hand to grab Edward by the throat. "Time to shut that smart mouth of yours." But Edward wasn't there when Bull's hand arrived. The old man had moved, not quickly exactly, but with a fluid precision that made Bull's grab miss by inches. It was like trying to catch smoke, or grab hold of water flowing through his fingers. Bull stumbled slightly, thrown off balance by the unexpected miss. He recovered quickly, his face flushing red with embarrassment and rage. The watching inmates had seen him whiff on what should have been the easiest grab imaginable, and he could already hear the whispers starting. "Hold still, you old bastard!" Bull snarled, lunging forward with both hands this time, determined to end this humiliation before it got worse. Edward sidestepped again, this time with a movement so smooth it looked choreographed. His cane came up in a gentle arc, not striking Bull, but simply redirecting his momentum, using the bigger man's own force to send him, stumbling past where Edward had been standing. The yard erupted in shocked murmurs. Bull Patterson, the man who controlled half the contraband trade in Milbrook, had just been made to look clumsy and ineffective by a 74-year-old inmate with a walking stick. The psychological damage was immediate and devastating. Bull spun around, his eyes wild with fury and disbelief. This couldn't be happening. The old man had to be getting lucky, catching him off guard with unexpected movements. But luck ran out eventually, and when it did, Bull would make sure Edward Crane paid for every second of this humiliation. "You think you're clever?" Bull roared, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "You think dancing around like some kind of ballerina is going to save you?" Edward remained perfectly still now, his breathing controlled and even. The cane rested lightly in his hands, no longer just a walking aid, but something that seemed to extend his reach and awareness. His pale blue eyes tracked every muscle twitch in Bull's massive frame, reading intentions before they became actions. "I think," Edward said calmly, "that you're about to learn the difference between being big and being dangerous." Bull charged forward like a freight train derailed, all 300 pounds of muscle and rage aimed at crushing the old man who had made him look like a fool. His massive fists swung in wide arcs, each punch carrying enough force to shatter concrete. But Edward wasn't where the punches landed. The elderly inmate moved like water around stone, his body flowing between Bull's attacks with an economy of motion that defied his age. Each dodge was precise, calculated, wasting no energy while making Bull's fury burn hotter. The cane in Edward's hands had become an extension of his body, deflecting strikes and redirecting Bull's momentum with surgical precision. The watching inmates pressed closer, forming a tight circle around the confrontation. This wasn't the quick beatdown they'd expected to witness. This was something else entirely. Something that made veteran criminals who'd seen every kind of violence suddenly feel like they were watching their first real fight. Bull's breathing grew ragged as his wild swings continued to find empty air. Sweat poured down his face, mixing frustration with exertion. His crew shouted encouragement, but their voices carried uncertainty now. Their invincible leader was being systematically dismantled by a man old enough to be his grandfather. "Stand still and fight me, you coward!" Bull roared, launching another devastating haymaker that would have decapitated a smaller man. Edward tilted his head slightly, letting the fist whistle past his ear close enough to ruffle his gray hair. "Fighting and brawling are different things," Edward replied calmly, his voice barely elevated despite the chaos swirling around him. "You're brawling. I'm just staying alive." The words hit Bull harder than any physical blow could have. They carried an authority that spoke of real combat, real violence where survival depended on skill rather than size. Bull's attacks became more desperate, more reckless, as he realized he was being outclassed by someone he'd dismissed as harmless. Edward's movements began to change. Where before he had simply evaded and redirected, now he started to counter. His cane snapped out in short, precise strikes that found pressure points along Bull's arms and ribs. Not devastating blows, but surgical applications of force that disrupted nerve function and made Bull's limbs feel increasingly uncooperative. "What the hell?" Bull gasped, shaking his right arm as numbness spread from his shoulder to his fingertips. He'd been hit harder before, taken beatings that left him unconscious, but he'd never felt anything like this. It was as if the old man knew exactly where to strike to turn Bull's own body against him. The crowd of inmates had gone completely silent now. Even the most hardened criminals recognized they were witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just an upset victory by an underdog. This was a masterclass in combat being delivered by someone they'd all written off as a harmless old man. Edward's next strike came without warning, his cane sweeping low to catch Bull behind the knee. The giant's leg buckled, sending him crashing to the concrete with a sound that echoed across the yard like a gunshot. Bull rolled to his feet quickly, his face purple with rage and embarrassment, but something fundamental had changed. For the first time in decades, Marcus Patterson felt genuinely afraid. "You're not human," Bull whispered, backing away from Edward despite every instinct screaming at him to press the attack. His crew looked on in shock as their leader retreated from an elderly man who hadn't even worked up a sweat. Edward advanced slowly, his cane tapping against the concrete with each measured step. The sound seemed amplified in the silence, like a countdown timer marking the seconds until something terrible happened. His pale blue eyes had taken on a quality that made grown men look away, a coldness that spoke of decisions made in darkness, where mercy was a luxury nobody could afford. "I'm exactly human," Edward said quietly. "That's what makes this so dangerous. Humans are the most efficient killers this planet has ever produced. We just usually hide it better." Bull's back hit the chain-link fence, the metal rattling under his weight. Nowhere left to run. Nowhere left to hide. The man who had ruled through fear and intimidation was cornered by someone who understood both concepts on a level Bull couldn't even comprehend. The elderly inmate stopped just outside Bull's reach, his breathing still controlled and even. He could have ended this confrontation at any point, and everyone watching knew it. The restraint he was showing wasn't mercy. It was the kind of professional discipline that came from years of making life and death decisions in situations where hesitation meant casualties. "Here's what's going to happen," Edward said, his voice carrying across the silent yard with crystal clarity. "You're going to walk away from this. You're going to tell your crew that this never happened. And you're going to make sure that nobody in this prison bothers me again." Bull's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. His entire world had been turned upside down in the span of 5 minutes. The power structure he'd built through violence and intimidation had been shattered by a man who looked like he should be playing checkers in a nursing home. "And if I don't?" Bull managed to croak out, though his voice lacked any of its former authority. Edward smiled then, and it was the most terrifying expression any of the watching inmates had ever seen. It wasn't cruel or mocking. It was the smile of someone who had seen things that would break ordinary minds, done things that would haunt normal people for lifetimes, and walked away from it all with his sanity intact. "Then you'll discover why they used to call me the Ghost," Edward replied softly. "And trust me when I say that's a lesson you don't want to learn." The silence stretched like a wire about to snap. Bull's crew shifted nervously, waiting for their leader to make a decision that would determine the future power structure of the entire prison. Other inmates held their breath, knowing they were witnessing a changing of the guard that would reshape everything they thought they knew about survival behind these walls. Bull's shoulders sagged as the fight went out of him completely. The humiliation was total, absolute, witnessed by dozens of men who would carry this story to every cell block in Milbrook. His reputation was destroyed, his authority shattered, his empire built on fear crumbling around him like sandcastles at high tide. "Yeah," Bull whispered, his voice barely audible. "Yeah, okay, we're done here." Edward nodded once, a gesture that somehow managed to be both gracious and dismissive. He bent down to retrieve his paperback Western from where it had fallen during the confrontation, brushing dust from its worn cover with the same care he might show a valuable antique. The crowd began to disperse slowly, inmates walking away in stunned silence. Conversations would start eventually, whispered discussions about what they'd witnessed. But for now, everyone needed time to process what had just happened. The natural order of things had been completely upended by a man they'd all dismissed as irrelevant. Bull's crew helped their fallen leader to his feet, their faces masks of confusion and fear. The man they'd followed without question had been reduced to a stammering shadow of his former self by someone who looked like he belonged in a retirement community rather than a maximum security prison. Edward returned to his concrete bench, settling back into his reading position as if nothing unusual had occurred. But everything had changed. The dynamic of power at Milbrook had shifted fundamentally, and every inmate who'd witnessed the confrontation knew it. Word spread through the prison like wildfire. By evening chow, every cell block buzzed with whispered accounts of the legendary takedown in the recreation yard. The details grew more elaborate with each telling, but the core truth remained consistent. The harmless old man wasn't harmless at all. Guards began hearing fragments of conversations, catching references to something extraordinary that had happened during afternoon recreation. But the inmate's code of silence held firm. What happened in the yard stayed in the yard, at least as far as official reports were concerned. Edward's cellmate, a nervous young man named Tommy who was serving 18 months for burglary, couldn't contain his curiosity when evening lockdown came. He'd heard the stories, seen the way other inmates looked at his elderly roommate with a mixture of awe and fear that hadn't been there that morning. "Is it true what they're saying?" Tommy whispered across the narrow space between their bunks. "Did you really take down Bull Patterson without throwing a single punch?" Edward looked up from his Western, considering the question carefully. The young man deserved some explanation, if only to help him understand the changed dynamics that would affect his own survival in this place. "Violence is a language," Edward said finally. "Most people only know how to shout in it. I speak it fluently." Tommy nodded as if that explained everything, though he clearly didn't understand the deeper implications. How could he? The boy had lived his entire life in a world where strength meant size, where power came from aggression, where respect was earned through intimidation. He'd never encountered someone who understood violence as an art form rather than a blunt instrument. "Were you in the military?" Tommy asked, his voice barely audible in the concrete cell. Edward closed his book and set it aside, staring up at the ceiling where shadows from the corridor lights painted geometric patterns on the concrete. Memories flickered through his mind like old film reels. Jungle patrols where every step might trigger an ambush. Desert compounds where enemies moved like ghosts in the night. Urban warfare where the difference between civilians and combatants was measured in milliseconds of decision-making. "For a while," Edward said simply. "Long time ago." But Tommy was young and persistent, emboldened by curiosity and the strange new respect his cellmate had earned. "What did you do? I mean, in the military?" Edward was quiet for so long that Tommy thought he'd fallen asleep. Then, just as the young man was about to give up and try to sleep himself, the elderly inmate spoke again. "I kept people alive," Edward said quietly, "including myself." The weight of those words settled over the cell like a heavy blanket. Tommy understood, on some instinctive level, that he'd just been given a glimpse into something vast and dangerous. Something that explained how a 74-year-old man with a walking cane had just dismantled the most feared inmate in Milbrook without breaking a sweat. Outside their cell, the prison settled into its nighttime rhythm. Guards made their rounds, keys jangling against metal, boots echoing through empty corridors. In cells throughout the facility, inmates lay awake thinking about what they'd witnessed, trying to reconcile the image of the harmless old man with the reality of what he'd demonstrated in the yard. Bull Patterson lay on his own narrow bunk, staring at the ceiling and replaying every moment of his humiliation. His body ached from the precise strikes Edward had delivered, nerve clusters that still tingled with residual numbness. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the psychological damage. In one afternoon, everything he'd built had been destroyed. His reputation, his authority, his ability to command fear and respect through intimidation. All of it swept away by someone he'd dismissed as an easy target, a harmless old fool who would provide an afternoon's entertainment for his crew. The other inmates would never look at him the same way again. They'd seen him reduced to a stammering coward by a man 3 decades his senior. Word would spread beyond Milbrook's walls, carried by transferred prisoners and released inmates. His legend would become a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating anyone. But Bull's humiliation was just the beginning. Because somewhere in the administrative offices of Milbrook Correctional Facility, a guard was about to run a routine background check that would reveal exactly who Edward Crane really was. And when that information surfaced, the entire prison would realize they'd been sharing space with a man whose military record read like something from a classified operations manual. The ghost was about to become visible again. The background check came back at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday night. Officer Janet Mills was working the graveyard shift in the administrative wing, running routine security updates on recent incidents. The confrontation in the yard had been reported as a minor scuffle, nothing requiring disciplinary action, but protocol demanded she verify the records of all parties involved. She pulled up Edward Crane's file expecting the usual story. White-collar crime, first-time offender, probably some accountant who got caught skimming from client accounts. The kind of inmate who kept his head down and counted days until release. What appeared on her screen made her coffee cup freeze halfway to her lips. Staff Sergeant Edward "the Ghost" Crane, 26 years active duty, 3 Bronze Stars, 2 Purple Hearts, Distinguished Service Cross. The citations went on for pages, each one documenting actions that read more like Hollywood scripts than real. Military operations. Operation Desert Storm, Somalia. 3 tours in Afghanistan. Each deployment marked by commendations for exceptional bravery under fire, for actions that saved the lives of fellow soldiers, for missions accomplished against impossible odds. But it was the classified sections that made Officer Mills reach for her phone to call the warden. Black Ops training, special reconnaissance, advanced combat techniques in urban warfare and close-quarters combat. The kind of skills that turned ordinary soldiers into weapons of surgical precision. Mills scrolled through incident reports spanning decades of service. Each one painted the picture of a man who had faced death so many times it became routine. Ambushes where he was the sole survivor. Hostage rescues performed behind enemy lines. Counterintelligence operations that prevented attacks on American soil. The next morning, when Officer Mills briefed the warden on Edward Crane's true identity, word spread through the guard stations like electricity through copper wire. Staff Sergeant "the Ghost" Crane wasn't just some elderly tax evader. He was a decorated war hero whose military record read like a classified manual on how to survive the unsurvivable. By afternoon count, even the guards were looking at Edward differently. The harmless old man reading westerns on his concrete bench had dismantled the prison's most feared bully, using skills honed in battlefields where hesitation meant death. Bull Patterson's humiliation wasn't luck or coincidence. It was the inevitable result of a predator meeting an apex predator. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one who looks the least threatening. Edward Crane had spent decades perfecting the art of invisible lethality, moving through the world like smoke until the moment action became necessary. Then the ghost became visible, and everyone remembered why legends are born from the quiet ones who never needed to prove themselves until someone forced their hand. This story reminds us that strength isn't always loud, power doesn't always advertise itself, and the gravest mistake you can make is underestimating someone based on what they choose to show you. If this story of hidden strength and quiet justice resonated with you, smash that like button and subscribe for more incredible stories that prove appearances can be the most dangerous deception of all.